Today is December 11th, and since I don't think the world is going to end with the conclusion of the Mayan calendar here in a week and a half, I want to talk about the future. I've been thinking quite a bit about the future of our country lately, and what role, if any, the church has to play. Our country has been changing for some time now. Beyond any arguments of whether or not America was ever really a Christian nation in the first place, we can all agree that at her inception, America and her people governed themselves by a Judeo-Christian worldview. Now at best, the pundits and professors refer to our home as a post-Christian nation. How did we get here? And perhaps, more importantly, what comes next? To understand that, let's start with the past. There are myriad elements we would need to consider for a full and complete understanding of our present position, and such a study would be better suited to a book, or perhaps a series of them. But especially as we consider our present social and cultural conflict, I would contend that we can trace our current state to a single development: the creation of our national public education system. This topic in and of itself warrants thick tomes. I won't examine the entire history of public schooling in America. Instead, we'll start with Horace Mann, whose work in this field during the early to mid-1800s earned him the title the Father of the Public School Movement. Mann advocated for the Prussian style of common schooling, which held to the philosophy that all were entitled to receive the same educational content. This model quickly found approval and implementation in the northeastern states. You see, although education had been a cornerstone of the American experiment from before the War for Independence, it remained until the late 19th and early 20th centuries a scattered and very non-uniform affair. All schools were locally administered with no input from the federal government whatsoever. It wasn't even until 1852 that the state of Massachusetts, due largely to Horace Mann's work, codified the Act concerning the attendance of children at school. This act was the first example of a compulsory attendance law at the state level in America. It required that every city or town have a public elementary school, and it also outlined the attendance requirements for all children between the ages of 8 and 14 and prescribed fines in the event of truancy. This early compulsory education system, some version of which every existing state had adopted by 1917, looked markedly different than it does today. In comparison to the 9-month school year used in most places now, most states then required a relatively short time in school. The Massachusetts law required attendance only 12 weeks out of the year. Additionally, Horace Mann himself said at the time that while the public schools were not theological seminaries, and they were required by law to abstain from preaching any particular doctrine or faith against another, that the system he and others were building would greatly encourage all Christian morals. He further stated that it would welcome the Bible and the religion that it taught, allowing the document to speak for itself to those who read it. While many at the time were still concerned about the overall secular tenor of those early public schools, Mr. Mann's attitude toward the Bible in his schools was certainly a far cry from the overt hostility toward all mention of Christianity we find in schools today. Now that hostility finds its roots in the progressive movement of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. During this time, the future course of public education in America was most dramatically affected by a man named John Dewey. Since his death, Dewey has often been referred to as the father of modern education, and the effects of his work are still felt profoundly in classrooms and boardrooms all across the country. And yet, despite this man's importance, very few know much of anything about him. John Dewey was no friend of the church. Rather, he was an avowed socialist and humanist, and even co-authored the Humanist Manifesto in 1933. I could spend an hour talking about him and all that he did. But for now, here are a few quotes with which every American Christian should familiarize themselves. First, Dewey said, "You can't make socialists out of individualists. Children who know how to think for themselves spoil the harmony of the collective society which is coming, where everyone is interdependent." Dewey further said, "There is no God, and there is no soul. Hence there is no need for the props of traditional religion. With dogma and creed excluded, then immutable truth is dead and buried. There is no room for fixed law or permanent moral absolutes." So from Dewey's own mouth, we have established that he was a socialist and believed it was a danger to socialism for children to actually know how to think for themselves. He was furthermore an atheist, who believed that there is no room for fixed law or moral absolutes. Truth, in Dewey's view, is a flexible notion, which can be molded as needed to suit our own individual tastes. But wait, you may say, the man's entitled to his opinions. How do we know he was really pushing for this in the schools? It's a fair question. Fortunately, Dewey's co-author of the Humanist Manifesto, a man named C.F. Potter, made their intentions quite clear for us when he said, "Education is thus the most powerful ally of humanism, and every American public school is a school of humanism. What can the theistic Sunday schools, meeting for an hour once a week, teaching only a fraction of the children, due to stem the tide of a 5-day program of humanistic teaching. These men knew exactly what they were doing. Sadly, they had a far better thought-out vision for the future they were trying to create than the vast majority of Christians ever have. They knew if they could capture the minds of the youth, they would win the war for the future with minimal effort. They shaped a system that was not designed to teach our youth how to think. They designed a system that would instead teach children what to think, their ultimate aim being a collective society, not of individuals, but of conditioned units prepared to all think alike, for their thinking had already been done for them. The events since Dewey's death in 1952 have moved forward like a snowball on a steep incline. The sexual revolution of the 1960s and the Vietnam War helped to shape a populace deeply distrustful of their parents' generation. Having been educated in a school system based on the humanistic worldview of Dewey and his colleagues, they were all too prepared to throw off the yoke of their parents' way of thinking. Their parents had believed in absolute truth. They'd believed in working hard and enjoying the fruits of one's own labor. But this new generation believed in what they wanted, and in a world of socialistic fiscal equality. As that generation grew up and now has taken the reins of authority in the country, we are beginning to see the complete fruition of what Dewey and Potter and all those like them began. We are beginning to see what it looks like when a country that was founded on Judeo-Christian faith and morals is overtaken instead by those espousing an atheistic faith with humanistic morals. Dewey and the rest knew that this could not be achieved directly, just as you can't put a frog in boiling water. They had to act slowly, changing how the people thought without them even realizing that it was happening. Now the parents, all too happy to be relieved of the responsibility of educating their own children, sent their children to these schools without so much as a whiff of concern for what their children were going to be taught. The mothers, now freed from the burden of caring for their children, entered the workforce, urged on by the feministic voices insisting they were just as entitled as their husbands to fulfilling careers and accomplishments. Lifestyles changed. Families were now spending beyond the means of one income, and it became the norm and even the need for both parents to work, while the state took full charge of their children. As parents now, we no longer prepare our children to face the world as thinking individuals. We merely turn them over to the government to take all the thought out of them, to craft mindless drones for what Dewey called the coming collective society. That's how we got here. When public schools began teaching tolerance and equality of worldviews, we allowed it. When the schools began teaching evolution as the mechanism of creation and erased God from the curriculum, we allowed it. When the schools began teaching that homosexuality was a completely normal and acceptable lifestyle, we allowed it. At every step, regardless of how many Christians actually rose up and complained about these changes, most gave their silent consent by refusing to remove their children from an institution that grew ever more godless. Rather than raising our children to be the light of the world, we turn them over to the darkness. I've heard so many parents even say that they send their kids to public school to be the light of the world. As we can now see clearly, that was a colossal mistake. Our own military knows better than to send children into combat. Yet we willingly sent our youngest, most impressionable souls into a minefield for which they were not equipped. I'm sure I'll draw the ire of many for saying this, but the Southern Baptist Convention isn't just randomly losing 88% of its young people after the first year of college. They are losing the battle for their children's hearts and minds years before that, because as C.F. Potter so rightly observed, 1 hour of religious instruction cannot compete with 40 hours of humanistic indoctrination. And when the parents are no longer there to take their kids to church, their kids just stop going altogether. We failed to teach our children how to think and how to live. They've instead been conditioned by the humanistic entities in Washington and Hollywood and Nashville to think about themselves. They've been brainwashed to want what they want regardless of who says it may be wrong. They've been taught to follow their hearts and to be who they are, rather than who God intended for them to be. And that's how we got here. Next time I'll examine the current landscape and what, if anything, we can do to turn a tide that has been growing unchecked for the better part of a century. Until then, I'm Jeremy Pond, and this is Reality Check.